There are some wounds that never fully close, not because the body refuses to heal, but because the soul remembers the fire that caused them. Dante Moretti lived with those wounds, carved into his hands like a map of every mistake he'd ever made, every life he'd failed to save. Every moment violence had marked him as its own. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd done to earn them. He was ashamed of what they represented, a life built on cruelty, a man who'd chosen power over peace. And in the dim light of expensive restaurants and exclusive clubs, surrounded by people who feared him, Dante carried those scars like chains, visible proof that some men are too damaged to deserve softness, until a waitress with gentle eyes touched his hand without flinching, and everything he believed about himself began to crack. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Comment where you're listening from. And if you feel it was really worth it, consider becoming a member to get early access to upcoming stories. Your support makes all the difference. The restaurant smelled of garlic, slow-roasted tomatoes, and fresh basil, scents that reminded Dante of a childhood he'd tried to forget. Nonna Rosa's was tucked into a quiet corner of North Beach, far from the sleek downtown establishments where men in his position usually conducted business. But Dante didn't come here for business. He came here because the old woman who owned it had known his grandmother, because the red-checkered tablecloths reminded him of Sunday dinners before blood stained his hands, because here, for 1 hour each week, he could pretend he was just a man eating pasta, not a monster wearing expensive suits. It was Thursday evening, just past 7, when the dinner rush began to slow. Dante sat in his usual corner booth, the one that faced the door, the one that let him see everyone who entered Old Habits, the kind that kept men like him alive. He'd ordered the same thing he always ordered, rigatoni alla vodka, a simple salad, espresso to finish. The routine was comforting, predictable, safe. He was reading the evening paper, not really absorbing the words, when he noticed her. She was new. Dante knew every server at Nonna Rosa's, had memorized their faces the way he memorized exits and potential threats. But this woman, she was unfamiliar small, maybe 5'3", with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore the standard uniform, black pants, white shirt, black apron. But something about the way she moved caught his attention. She didn't rush, didn't perform, just moved through the space with quiet competence, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, offering small, genuine smiles to the elderly couples who made up most of the clientele. Dante watched her without meaning to. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was curiosity. In his world, everyone performed, everyone wanted something. But this woman, she seemed content to simply exist in the moment, to do her job without agenda. It was refreshing, dangerous. She approached his table with a water pitcher, and Dante instinctively pulled his hands back, tucking them closer to his body. Another old habit. Hide the evidence. Don't let them see. "Can I refill that for you?" Her voice was soft, almost musical. A slight accent, maybe from somewhere south, Napoli perhaps, or Sicilia. "Yes, thank you," Dante replied, his voice rougher than he intended. He hadn't spoken much today, hadn't needed to. When you're the man people fear, silence does most of the talking. She poured the water with steady hands, then paused, noticing his untouched bread basket. "The focaccia is fresh from the oven. Nonna Rosa made it herself this afternoon. She uses her mother's recipe, rosemary and sea salt. It's perfect with olive oil." Dante looked up at her then, really looked brown eyes, warm and deep like espresso. No makeup, or so little he couldn't tell. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes that suggested she smiled often. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, not like the women who draped themselves on powerful men's arms at charity galas. but there was something luminous about her, something real. "I'll try it," he said, surprising himself. She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes, and moved to the next table. Dante found himself watching the way she interacted with the older couple near the window, the way she listened when the elderly woman told a long story about her grandson, the way she laughed softly at the punchline. No impatience, no performance, just presence. His rigatoni arrived 15 minutes later, brought by the usual server, Marco, who knew better than to make small talk. Dante ate slowly, methodically, barely tasting the food. His mind was elsewhere, tracking the new waitress as she moved through the dining room. He noticed she favored her left ankle slightly, a barely perceptible limp, an old injury perhaps. He noticed she kept a small notepad in her apron pocket, but rarely needed to consult it, her memory sharp. He noticed she said, "Prego," instead of, "You're welcome," a small detail that confirmed his suspicion about her origins. By the time he finished his meal, Dante had constructed an entire profile. Southern Italian immigrant, probably sent money home to family, worked hard, kept her head down, stayed out of trouble. The kind of woman who deserved better than this city, better than men like him occupying her tables. She returned as he was finishing his espresso, carrying the check in a small leather folder. "Did you enjoy everything?" "It was excellent, as always," Dante replied. He pulled out his wallet, extracting several bills, far more than the meal cost. He always tipped well. It was the least he could do, the only kindness his blood-stained money could buy. As she reached for the folder, their hands touched, just for a second. Her fingers brushed against his knuckles, against the raised scars that covered his right hand like angry rivers. Dante flinched, pulling back instinctively, expecting the usual reaction, the widening eyes, the quick withdrawal, the poorly masked disgust. But she didn't recoil. Instead, she looked at his hand, really looked, then raised her eyes to meet his. There was no pity there, no horror, just a quiet curiosity, maybe even recognition. "Those look old," she said softly, her voice carrying no judgment, only observation. Dante's jaw tightened. He wanted to pull his hand away, to hide it under the table, to leave cash on the tablecloth and walk out without another word. But something in her tone stopped him. She wasn't asking for the story, wasn't demanding explanation, just acknowledging what existed, the way you might comment on rain or sunset, a fact of nature requiring no apology. "They are," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, then did something that would change everything. She reached out, slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand gently over his scarred knuckles. Her palm was warm, soft, steady. Not a gesture of pity, not an attempt to heal, or fix, or save. Just connection, just touch, just acknowledgement that he was human beneath the damage Dante's breath caught. He stared at their joined hands, at the contrast between her unblemished skin and his ruined flesh, and felt something crack open inside his chest. When was the last time someone had touched him like this? Without fear, without agenda, without pretense? Then he did something that surprised them both. His free hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist, not hard, not threatening, but firm, holding her there, holding her to the moment. His eyes locked on hers, and words tumbled out before he could stop them. "Don't pity me," he said, his voice raw, desperate. "Love me." The words hung between them like smoke, impossible to take back. Dante's heart hammered against his ribs. What had he done? What had he revealed? This woman was a stranger. He was a man who built empires on secrets, who survived by keeping everyone at arm's length, who never showed weakness. But her eyes didn't change, didn't fill with the uncomfortable sympathy he despised. Instead, something shifted in her expression, something that looked almost like understanding. "I don't pity you," she said quietly, her wrist still caught in his grasp, her other hand still resting on his scars. "I don't even know you yet." Yet that single word carried so much weight. Possibility. Future. Hope. Dante released her wrist slowly, suddenly aware that other diners might be watching, that he was drawing attention, breaking his own rules about staying invisible. She stepped back, creating professional distance, but her eyes held his for one more moment. "My name is Julia," she said. "I'm new here. Started last week." "Dante," he replied, though something told him she already knew. Everyone knew, eventually. Everyone learned that the quiet man in the corner booth was someone to avoid, someone whose name carried weight and warning. But she just smiled, collected the check folder with his generous tip, and said, "I hope you come back soon, Dante. The Thursday special next week is osso buco. Nonna Rosa's recipe, you'll like it." Then she walked away, and Dante sat in the empty booth, feeling like a building after an earthquake, still standing but fundamentally altered, cracks running through the foundation. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over, her hand on his. His desperate words, her calm response, the way she'd said his name, like it was just a name, not a curse. The scars on his hands throbbed, the way they always did when he remembered how he'd earned them 10 years ago. A warehouse fire. 3 of his men trapped inside. Dante had gone in after them, pulled 2 out, gone back for the 3rd. The burning beam had fallen across the exit. Just as he'd reached the final man, Dante had lifted it with his bare hands, flesh searing, skin melting, pain so intense he'd nearly passed out. But he'd held it long enough for the man to crawl through, long enough to save one life. The man had died anyway. Smoke inhalation, dead on arrival at the hospital. And Dante had lived, marked forever by his failure, by the proof that even when he tried to be good, to do right, death still won. He'd stopped trying after that, stopped pretending he could be anything other than what the scars proclaimed, a man touched by fire, marked by violence, destined for loneliness. But Julia had touched him, had looked at the evidence of his worst moment and hadn't flinched. Thursday came again, slowly. Dante told himself he wouldn't go back to Nonna Rosa's, told himself he'd broken his pattern enough, revealed enough, risked enough. There were a dozen other restaurants in the city. He didn't need ritual, didn't need routine. But when Thursday evening arrived, he found himself walking through the door at 7 o'clock sharp, the small bell above the entrance chiming his arrival. Nonna Rosa herself was at the host stand, a tiny woman in her 80s, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd known his grandmother, had served his family for 3 generations, and she was one of the few people in the city who looked at Dante without fear. "Ah, Dante," she said, her accent thick and comforting. "Your usual table? Per favore, nonna." She led him to the corner booth, moving slowly but with dignity, and placed a menu in front of him, even though they both knew he wouldn't need it. "Julia is working tonight," she said casually, too casually. "She asked if you'd be coming." Dante's heart did something stupid in his chest. Did she? Nonna Rosa's eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief. "That girl, she's special, works harder than anyone I've ever hired, sends half her pay back to her mother in Napoli, never complains, never asks for anything." She paused, then added quietly, "She's alone here. You know, no family, no friends yet, just work, and a tiny apartment in the Tenderloin." It wasn't subtle. Nonna Rosa had never been subtle, but Dante appreciated the information, filed it away in the part of his brain that collected details, built profiles, assessed vulnerabilities. "I'll have the osso buco," he said, changing the subject. Nonna Rosa smiled, patted his shoulder with a weathered hand, and shuffled toward the kitchen. Julia appeared 10 minutes later with water and bread. She wore the same uniform, same practical bun, but something about her seemed brighter tonight. "You came back," Julia said, and there was a note of pleasure in her voice that made Dante's chest feel too tight. "You recommended the osso buco," he replied. "I trust Nonna Rosa's recipes." "You should. She taught me to make the gremolata this afternoon. Lemon zest, garlic, parsley. Fresh, not dried. She's very particular about that." Julia poured his water with steady hands. "Do you cook?" The question was so ordinary, so normal, that Dante almost didn't know how to answer. When was the last time someone had asked him about cooking, about anything that wasn't business, territory, money, or blood? "Not anymore," he said carefully. "My grandmother tried to teach me when I was young. I wasn't patient enough." "Cooking requires patience," Julia agreed, "and love. You can taste it when someone cooks with resentment. The food is different." She said it matter-of-factly, as if it were universal truth rather than philosophy. Dante found himself wanting to hear more, wanting to understand how she saw the world. This woman who touched scars without fear and spoke about love in tomato sauce. "I'll bring your osso buco when it's ready," she said, moving to leave. "Julia," Dante called, then paused, unsure what he'd meant to say. She turned, waiting. "Last week, what I said. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Her expression softened. "You didn't. You were honest. That's rare. Honesty is dangerous in my world. Then maybe you need a different world." She walked away before he could respond, before he could explain that men like him didn't get different worlds, that they were locked into the ones they'd built with blood and choices and consequences. The osso buco was perfect, tender veal falling off the bone, rich saffron risotto, the bright cut of gremolata on top. Dante ate slowly, savoring each bite, and tried not to watch Julia move through the dining room, but his eyes found her anyway, tracking her conversations with regulars, the way she remembered that Mrs. Chen liked extra parmesan, that Mr. Russo needed his coffee with 3 sugars, that the young couple by the window was celebrating an anniversary. She cared. That was the difference. In a city where most people performed care as transaction, Julia actually gave a damn. When she brought his espresso, she lingered for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The scars on your hands, were you trying to save someone?" Dante's breath stopped. How had she known? What had she seen that others missed? "I was," he admitted. "I failed." "But you tried," Julia said gently. "That matters, does it? He died anyway." "Yes, it matters. Because you could have walked away. You could have chosen safety. But you didn't. You chose to try. That says everything about who you are." Dante looked up at her, this small woman with wise eyes, and felt something dangerous bloom in his chest. Hope. The most lethal emotion for a man in his position. "I don't think you know who I am," he said carefully. "Then tell me." "You wouldn't like what you heard." Julia pulled out the chair across from him, an audacious move that would have made his men nervous, and sat down. It was late enough that the restaurant was nearly empty, just a couple lingering over wine in the far corner. She folded her hands on the table and met his gaze directly. "Try me," she said. So Dante did something he'd never done before. He told the truth. Not all of it. Not the bloody details or the criminal specifics. But the outline, the shape of his life. "My family has run certain businesses in this city for 3 generations, he began, choosing words carefully. Businesses that exist in gray areas. I took over when my father died. I was 25. I didn't want it. But family, is family. Duty is duty. Certain businesses, Julia repeated, and there was no judgment in her tone, like the kind Nonna Rosa's grandfather ran in Napoli before the war. Dante's eyebrows rose. She understood. Of course she did. She was from the South, from cities where everyone knew how the world really worked, where respectability and criminality often wore the same face. Similar, he acknowledged. And the scars? A warehouse fire. 10 years ago I tried to save my men. Succeeded with 2. Failed with the 3rd. You went into a burning building. Yes. Twice. 3 times. Julia was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over his again, the same gentle touch as before. You're not what you think you are. You don't know what I think. I know you think you're damaged, cursed, too broken to deserve softness. Her thumb traced the edge of a scar. I know, because I see it in how you hold yourself, how you sit in corners, how you pull away when anyone gets close. Dante's throat felt tight. I've done things, Julia, things that would make you leave this table and never come back. Maybe, but I don't know those things yet. I only know what I see, and I see a man who tips generously, who treats Nonna Rosa with respect, who tried to save people from fire even though it destroyed his hands, who eats alone every Thursday and looks sad while doing it. I'm not sad. I'm careful. You're lonely, Julia corrected gently. There's a difference. No one had said that to him before. No one had named what he felt. Loneliness. Not the absence of people. Dante was surrounded by people, but the absence of connection. The absence of anyone who saw him as human rather than useful or dangerous. I should let you work, he said, deflecting, protecting himself the only way he knew how. But Julia didn't move. When do you eat? What? When do you eat? Real food, not business dinners or rushed lunches. When do you sit down and actually enjoy a meal? Thursdays, here. Only Thursdays? It's enough. It's not, Julia said firmly. Food is meant to be shared, enjoyed, celebrated. Once a week isn't living, Dante. It's surviving. She stood then, smoothing her apron. I finish at 10. If you're still here, I'll make you something from Nonna Rosa's kitchen, something my mother taught me. Real Napoli food, not menu items, just for you. Before he could respond, she walked away, leaving Dante sitting in the booth, feeling like he'd been struck by lightning, burned, but somehow more alive. Dante should have left, should have paid his bill, walked out into the night, and never returned. Instead, he ordered another espresso and pretended to read the newspaper, while the minutes crawled toward 10 o'clock. He told himself he was curious about the food, about authentic Napoli cooking. But the truth thrummed beneath his ribs like a second heartbeat. He was curious about her. At 9:45, Nonna Rosa emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She saw Dante still sitting there and smiled, a knowing expression that made him feel transparent. Julia told me to leave the kitchen open for her, said she was making something special. The old woman's eyes twinkled. She doesn't do that for just anyone. She's kind, Dante said carefully. Probably takes pity on sad men eating alone. Julia doesn't pity anyone. She recognizes. There's a difference. Nonna Rosa patted his shoulder. Don't run from this, Caro. You've been running long enough. She left through the front door, locking it behind her, but leaving Dante inside trust. Another thing he wasn't used to receiving. The last customer departed at 9:58. Julia flipped the sign to "Closed," dimmed the dining room lights, and disappeared into the kitchen. Dante heard the sounds of cooking. Water running, pans clattering, the hiss of heat. The scent that emerged made his mouth water. Garlic, tomatoes, basil. Something else he couldn't identify. Something that smelled like memory. She emerged 20 minutes later, carrying 2 plates and a bottle of red wine tucked under her arm. She'd removed her apron and let her hair down. It fell in dark waves to her shoulders, softening her face. She looked younger, less guarded. "I hope you're hungry," she said, setting the plates on his table. "This is my mother's recipe for pasta alla genovese. Not the pesto one, the other one. Slow-cooked onions and beef. It takes hours. But Nonna Rosa had some prepared, so I just had to finish it." The pasta was simple, almost humble-looking, wide ribbons coated in dark, rich sauce, but the smell was intoxicating. Dante picked up his fork, twirled the pasta, took a bite, and closed his eyes. The flavor was profound, sweet from the onions that had cooked down to almost nothing, savory from the beef, complex layers that spoke of patience and care. "My mother made this every Sunday," Julia said, sitting across from him with her own plate. "She'd start at dawn. The onions had to cook for at least 4 hours low heat, constant attention. She said you couldn't rush love or Genovese." "It's incredible," Dante said, and meant it. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Julia poured wine into 2 glasses, a simple Chianti that complemented the rich pasta perfectly. The restaurant around them felt like a different world, intimate and safe, removed from the city beyond the windows. "Tell me about Napoli," Dante said. "Why did you leave?" Julia took a sip of wine, considering. "My father died when I was 16. Heart attack. After that, my mother struggled. 5 children, no husband, no money. I was the oldest. I came here 3 years ago to work, to send money home. My siblings are in school now. My mother has enough to eat. That's what matters. You sacrificed your life for them. I didn't sacrifice anything. I chose. There's a difference." She met his eyes. "We all make choices, Dante. The question is whether we make them from love or from fear." "And which did you choose from?" "Love. Always love." She paused. "What about you? Your choices. Love or fear?" Dante set down his fork. "Fear, mostly. Duty. Obligation. The belief that I didn't deserve anything better. Because of the scars. Because of everything the scars represent. Because men who make the choices I've made don't get happy endings. Don't deserve them." Julia leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Who decided that? Who made that rule? The universe, God. Karma. Take your pick. I pick none of those. I think you decided. I think you built a prison and locked yourself inside and convinced yourself you deserved to be there." Her voice was gentle but firm. "But Dante, you have the key. You've always had it." He wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons she was wrong, all the evidence that proved he was beyond redemption. But looking at her across the table, at this woman who'd crossed an ocean for her family, who worked herself to exhaustion and still had enough kindness left to feed a stranger, he couldn't find the words. "Why are you doing this?" he asked instead. "Why do you care?" "Because I recognize you," Julia said simply. "I see someone carrying weight that isn't entirely his to carry. Someone who's forgotten that he's allowed to put it down sometimes. Someone who's been alone so long he's forgotten what connection feels like. You see all that?" "I see enough." She reached across the table again, but this time, instead of touching his scars, she took his hand and turned it palm up. Her finger traced the deepest burn scar, the one that ran from his wrist to his fingertips. "These tell a story about a man who runs toward fire, not away from it. About someone who values other lives more than his own safety. That's not a villain, Dante. That's a hero who doesn't know it yet. Heroes don't do the things I've done. And what have you done? Really done? Not what your family does or your business requires. What have you personally done?" Dante thought about it. Truly thought. His hands were clean, relatively speaking, He'd never killed anyone. Had hurt people, yes, in business and in protection. But murder? Innocence? No. His sins were sins of association, of enabling, of not stopping things he had the power to stop. Sins of silence and complicity, but not the ones he'd convinced himself he carried. I've allowed things, he said slowly. Looked the other way. Protected people who maybe didn't deserve protection. Have you ever hurt someone who didn't pose a threat? Someone innocent? No. Have you ever enjoyed causing pain? No. Then maybe you're not the monster you think you are. Maybe you're just a man who made choices in impossible circumstances and is carrying guilt for an entire system rather than his actual actions. It was too much, too close, too true. Dante pulled his hand back, creating distance. You don't understand my world. You're right, I don't. But I understand people. And I understand that everyone deserves a chance to be seen for who they really are, not who they're afraid they've become. The wine bottle was half empty, the pasta was gone, the night pressed against the windows, and Dante sat across from Julia, feeling like he was standing at a crossroads he hadn't known existed. I should go, Dante said, but made no move to stand. Julia smiled, a knowing expression. Should you? It's late. You've been working since this afternoon. You need rest. I need a lot of things, Julia said softly. Rest is somewhere on the list. She collected their plates, stacking them neatly. Help me clean up? It was such a simple request, so domestic, that Dante found himself nodding before he could think better of it. They moved into the kitchen together, and Julia handed him a towel while she washed dishes. The rhythm was comfortable, familiar in a way that made no sense. They'd known each other for exactly 2 weeks, had spoken for maybe an hour total, yet standing beside her at the sink, drying plates while she scrubbed, felt more natural than anything Dante had done in years. My grandmother taught me to cook in a kitchen like this, he found himself saying. Smaller, in an apartment in North Beach. She'd make me dry the dishes while she washed. Said it taught patience and respect for the work. Wise woman, Julia said. Did you listen? Not well enough. I was always in a hurry. Always wanted to be somewhere else, doing something more important. Dante set a dry plate on the stack. I'd give anything for one more evening drying her dishes. What happened to her? Cancer. 15 years ago. She made me promise before she died that I'd find something honest to love, something that had nothing to do with family business or obligation. His throat felt tight. I never did. Julia's hand stilled in the soapy water. Maybe you weren't ready then. Maybe you needed to carry all that weight first, so you'd recognize lightness when you found it. Or maybe I'm just broken enough that I'll ruin anything good that comes near me. She turned to face him, water dripping from her hands. You keep saying that. Keep insisting you're broken. But Dante, everything breaks. Glass breaks. Bones break. Hearts break. It's part of being alive. The question isn't whether you're broken. It's what you do after. Do you stay shattered, or do you find a way to put yourself back together? And if the pieces don't fit anymore, then you make something new, something that incorporates the cracks instead of hiding them. She gestured to his hands. Like kintsugi, Japanese art. They repair broken pottery with gold, making the cracks part of the beauty. The piece is more valuable after breaking because it carries its history. Dante looked at his scarred hands, at the evidence of fire and failure. You think these make me more valuable? I think they make you real. Make you someone who's lived and struggled and survived. That's infinitely more valuable than perfection. Julia dried her hands on a towel, then did something bold. She took both his hands in hers, holding them between them like an offering. I'm not afraid of your scars, Dante. I'm afraid you'll never let anyone close enough to prove that you deserve to be loved exactly as you are." The kitchen was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Dante stood there, hands held in Julia's smaller ones, feeling the warmth of her skin against his damaged flesh, and made a choice. Not from fear, not from duty, from something else entirely. "I haven't let anyone close in 10 years, he said quietly. "I don't know how anymore. Don't know if I'm capable of it." "You're capable," Julia said. "You're here, aren't you? You stayed. You talked. You let me see parts of you. I'm guessing very few people see. That's how it starts. And then what? Then you come back Thursday night, or maybe another night too. You let it be easy instead of making it complicated. You let yourself enjoy something without waiting for it to hurt. Everything hurts eventually." "Yes," Julia agreed. "But some things heal too. Some things make the hurt worth it." She released his hands but held his gaze. "I'm not promising you perfect, Dante. I'm not even promising you easy. But I'm promising you real. No pretending. No performance. Just two people who see each other clearly and choose to show up anyway." Dante felt something crack inside him, some wall he'd built so carefully beginning to crumble. "Why me? You could choose anyone. Someone without my history. My complications. Because you brought your scars into the light instead of hiding them. Because you told the truth even when it was dangerous. Because when I touched you, you didn't perform strength. You asked for love." Julia smiled. "That takes more courage than anything else." They stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by clean dishes and the lingering scent of garlic and wine. And Dante made a decision that terrified him. He was going to try. Going to let himself want this. Want her. Want the possibility of something beyond loneliness and careful distance. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Neither do I," Julia said. "But we can figure it out together." She walked him to the door, unlocking it to let him into the night. Before he stepped through, she rose on her toes and kissed his cheek. A gentle brush of lips against skin that made his breath catch. "Thursday," she said. "Come for dinner. Stay after. We'll cook together. I'll be here." Dante walked home through the quiet streets, hands in his pockets, and for the first time in a decade, he felt something other than resignation about his future. He felt curiosity, hope, the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could be someone other than the sum of his scars and mistakes. Thursday came slowly. Dante found himself thinking about Julia at odd moments. During business meetings, he'd remember the way she'd traced his scars without fear. While reviewing territory reports, he'd recall her voice saying he wasn't broken, just changed. At night, alone in his apartment, he'd replay the moment she'd held his hands and promised him real instead of perfect. When Thursday arrived, Dante showed up at Nonna Rosa's at 6, an hour earlier than usual. The restaurant was still in the middle of dinner rush, tables full. The sound of conversation and clinking silverware creating a warm buzz. Julia saw him immediately. Her face lit up with genuine pleasure, and she weaved through tables to greet him. "You're early," she said, smiling. "I finished work early." A lie. He'd rearranged his entire schedule, delegated meetings, ignored calls from associates who needed decisions, all to be here an hour sooner. "Your usual table is taken," Julia said, glancing at the corner booth where an elderly couple was sharing tiramisu. "But I have a better spot tonight." She led him to a small two-top near the kitchen, tucked away but somehow more intimate than his usual corner. "You can watch me work from here, and when we close, we're already close to the kitchen." She was planning ahead, planning for after. The realization made Dante's chest feel warm. The evening passed in a comfortable rhythm. Julia brought him food, without asking what he wanted, introducing him to dishes that weren't on the menu. A simple caprese made with tomatoes from Nonna Rosa's garden. Fresh pasta with a butter and sage sauce so delicate it tasted like silk. A small portion of braised rabbit that melted on his tongue. Between courses, she'd pause at his table, stealing moments to talk. "Nonna Rosa asked about you," Julia said during one visit. "Asked if you were coming tonight. What did you tell her?" "The truth, that I hoped so." She refilled his water glass. "She told me something interesting. She said your grandmother and her grandmother were friends, that they used to cook together every Sunday." Dante felt surprise ripple through him. "I didn't know that." "Nonna Rosa remembers you as a little boy, said you used to help in the kitchen, that you had gentle hands even then." Julia's eyes were soft. "She said your grandmother would be proud of the man you became, that you protected your family even when it cost you." "She doesn't know what I've done." "She knows enough. She's lived in this city for 84 years, Dante. You think she doesn't understand how the world works? How families like yours survive?" Julia touched his shoulder lightly. "She sees you clearly, and she approves of you being here. Of us." Us. The word hung between them, full of implication and promise. At 10 o'clock, Julia locked the door behind the last customer. This time, Dante was already in the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves. "Put me to work," he said. She laughed, delighted. "You're serious? You said we'd cook together. I'm here to cook." What followed was the most natural evening of Dante's adult life. Julia taught him to make her mother's recipe for Parmigiana, layering thin slices of fried eggplant with tomato sauce and mozzarella. She showed him how to test oil temperature with a piece of bread, how to salt eggplant to draw out bitterness, how to tear basil instead of cutting it to preserve flavor. And as they worked side by side, she told him stories. Stories about growing up in Napoli, sharing a small apartment with her siblings, about her father, who'd worked construction and sung opera in the shower, about her mother, who could make a feast from nothing, who taught her daughters that food was love made visible. "My mother says you can tell everything about a person by how they cook," Julia said, watching Dante carefully layer eggplant. "Patient people make the best sauces. Generous people always make too much. Fearful people follow recipes exactly. What kind of cook am I?" She studied him, considering. "Careful, precise. But underneath, I think you're learning to be brave." They assembled the Parmigiana in a terracotta dish, layering ingredients like building something sacred. When it went into the oven, Julia set a timer and poured them each a glass of wine. They sat on stools at the prep counter, comfortable in the warm kitchen. "Can I ask you something personal?" Julia said. "Yes." "The man who died in the fire, the one you tried to save. Did you know him well?" Dante's hands tightened around his wine glass. "Marco. His name was Marco Benedetti. He'd worked for my family since he was 18. He was 27 when he died, engaged to be married. His fiancée was pregnant." He paused, the old guilt rising. "I got him killed. My decision to store certain merchandise in that warehouse, my choice put him in danger." "What was he doing there?" "Night watch, making sure no one broke in." "So he chose to be there, chose to take that job, that risk. He didn't know the risk." "Dante," Julia's voice was firm, "you went into that fire 3 times. You could have died. You nearly did. You sacrificed your hands, your body, trying to save him. How is that getting him killed? If I hadn't been in that business, if I'd chosen differently, he'd never have been there. And if he'd chosen differently, he wouldn't have worked for you. If his parents had chosen differently, they wouldn't have moved to this city. If the universe had chosen differently, there wouldn't have been a fire that night." Julia took his scarred hand. "You can't carry responsibility for every consequence of every choice ever made by everyone involved. You can only carry responsibility for your actions, and your actions were heroic. I failed him. You tried to save him when you could have run, when most people would have run. That's not failure, Dante. That's the opposite." She said it with such certainty, such conviction, that something in Dante's chest loosened. The guilt didn't disappear. It would never fully disappear. But it shifted, became something he could carry instead of something that crushed him. The timer chimed. Giulia pulled the Parmigiana from the oven, golden and bubbling. They ate standing at the counter, sharing the dish straight from the pan, and it was the best thing Dante had ever tasted. Not because of the recipe or technique, but because of the company. Because of the way Giulia laughed when cheese burned his tongue. Because of the way she told him about her sister's wedding and asked about his childhood. Because for the first time in years, Dante wasn't eating alone. When the pan was empty and the wine bottle drained, Giulia looked at him seriously. "I need to tell you something." Dante braced himself. Here it comes. The withdrawal. The realization that he's too complicated, too damaged. But Giulia said, "I like you. Really like you. And that terrifies me." Of all the things he'd expected, that wasn't it. Why? Because I came to this city to work, to be practical, to send money home and not get distracted by wants or desires or feelings. And then you appeared. And now I think about you constantly. Wonder what you're doing, if you're eating properly, if you're lonely. She met his eyes. I'm supposed to be focused on my family, on my responsibilities. But instead, I'm here, cooking for a man I barely know, hoping he'll stay a little longer. Dante reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with his scarred hand. I think about you constantly, too. I rearranged my entire day to be here an hour earlier. I've never done that for anyone. "What are we doing?" Giulia whispered. "I don't know, but I don't want to stop." She leaned into his palm, turning her head slightly to press a kiss against the worst of his scars. The gesture was so tender, so accepting, that Dante felt his throat close with emotion. "I'm afraid I'll hurt you," he said. "Not physically, but my life, my world, it's complicated. Dark. I don't want that darkness to touch you. Dante, I'm not made of glass. I'm not some delicate thing that will shatter at the first hard truth." Giulia's eyes were fierce. "I crossed an ocean alone at 23. I work 2 jobs and send most of my money to a family I won't see for years. I live in a tiny apartment in a dangerous neighborhood because it's what I can afford. I'm stronger than you think." "I know you're strong. That's not what I'm afraid of." "Then what?" He struggled to find words for the fear that lived in his chest. "I'm afraid you'll see too much. See all of me, not just the parts I show on Thursday nights. And when you do, you'll realize I'm not worth the effort." Giulia stepped closer until they were inches apart. "Let me decide what I'm capable of handling. Let me decide what you're worth to me." She placed her hand over his heart. "You've spent so long protecting everyone else. Let someone protect you for a change, even if it's just protecting you from your own worst thoughts about yourself." Dante's resolve crumbled. He pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest, feeling her warmth seep into the cold places he'd carried for so long. She fit perfectly there, her head tucked under his chin, her arms wrapped around his waist. They stood like that for a long moment, just breathing together. "Stay," Giulia said quietly. "Not here, but with me. In this. Whatever this becomes." "I'm staying," Dante promised. "I don't know how to do this right, but I'm staying." They cleaned the kitchen together in comfortable silence, Dante washing while Giulia dried, reversing their roles from the previous week. When everything was put away and the lights were dimmed, they walked outside together. The street was quiet, fog rolling in from the bay. "Let me walk you home," Dante said. "It's not safe for me to let a strange man know where I live," Giulia teased. Then let me call you a car. I take the bus. Not tonight. Dante pulled out his phone, and within minutes, a sleek black car pulled up. His driver, Tony, nodded respectfully, but didn't ask questions. Tony will take you home safely. Julia hesitated. This is too much. It's late. The Tenderloin isn't safe at this hour. Please, let me have this peace of mind. She studied his face, then nodded. Okay, but only because you asked instead of demanded. Before she got in the car, she turned back and kissed him. Not on the cheek this time, but on the mouth. A soft, brief kiss that tasted like wine and promise and possibility. Then she was gone, the car pulling away into the fog, leaving Dante standing on the sidewalk, feeling like he'd been set on fire in the best possible way. The following weeks developed a rhythm. Thursday nights at Nonna Rosa's became sacred, inviolable. Dante showed up at 6. They'd share dinner, then cook together after closing. Sometimes Julia would teach him recipes from her childhood. Sometimes they'd experiment, inventing new dishes, laughing when things went wrong. Always they'd talk, really talk, about everything and nothing. Julia told him about her dreams, how she wanted to open her own restaurant someday, a small place that served authentic Napoli food, how she missed her mother's voice, the sound of her siblings laughing, how she felt guilty for being happy when her family was so far away. Dante told her about the weight of family legacy, how he'd inherited a business he'd never wanted, but couldn't walk away from. How he employed hundreds of people whose families depended on his decisions. How he navigated a world where showing weakness meant death, where trust was currency and betrayal was business as usual. Why don't you leave? Julia asked one night. If you hate it, why stay? Because walking away would cause a war. Other families would move in. The people who depend on me would be vulnerable. And because, despite everything, it's my family's legacy. My grandfather built it. My father died for it. I can't just abandon that. Even if it's killing you slowly. Dante looked at his scarred hands. I've made peace with slow death. It's preferable to fast chaos. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard, Julia said quietly. Then, what if there was a third option? Not leaving entirely, but changing what it means. Making it something you could live with? Like what? I don't know. But you're smart, creative. If you spent as much energy reimagining your life as you spend maintaining it, maybe you'd find a different path. The idea took root in Dante's mind. What if he could transform the family business, move into legitimate enterprises, use his connections for legal trade instead of gray markets? It would take years, careful maneuvering, strategic patience. But maybe, just maybe, it was possible. But more than business transformations, Dante was transforming internally. Julia's presence in his life was changing how he saw himself. When he looked at his scars now, he didn't just see failure. He saw evidence of courage, of sacrifice, of choosing to try even when the cost was high. When he sat in meetings with other family heads, he found himself thinking about what Julia would say, how she'd see through the posturing to the human fears underneath. He started making different choices, small ones at first. He refused a contract that would have put immigrant workers at risk. He personally ensured that a neighborhood restaurant being pressured for protection money was left alone. He set aside money from his personal accounts to fund scholarships for kids from his old neighborhood. And every Thursday, he showed up at Nonna Rosa's, and Julia smiled like he was the best thing she'd seen all day. 3 months into their growing relationship, everything changed. It was a Tuesday when Dante's phone rang at midnight. Carlo, his second in command, his voice tight with tension. We have a problem. The Rossetti family is making moves on the waterfront. They're saying you've gone soft, that you're distracted. Distracted. The word hung heavy. They meant Julia. Somehow they'd noticed his pattern, his Thursday absences, his shifting priorities. "What kind of moves?" Dante asked, his voice cold. "Territory challenges. They hit one of our shipping operations tonight. No casualties. But the message is clear. They're testing you." Dante closed his eyes. This was the darkness he'd been afraid of. The inevitable collision between his world and the light Julia represented. "Set up a meeting. I'll handle it." He didn't sleep that night. Didn't go to Nonna Rosa's on Thursday. Instead, he sent a text to Julia. "Something's come up, I can't make it tonight. I'm sorry." Her response was immediate. "Is everything okay?" "It will be. I'll explain when I can." He spent the next week managing the crisis, meeting with the Rossetti family, making it clear that distracted didn't mean weak. Reminding everyone why his family had held power for 3 generations. It required violence, not his own hands, but his orders. And it made him feel sick. Made him remember all the reasons he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve happiness. When Dante finally returned to Nonna Rosa's the following Thursday, it had been 2 weeks since he'd seen Julia. He arrived at his usual time, exhausted and hollow, carrying the weight of decisions that had kept the peace, but cost him pieces of his soul. The restaurant was busy, but Julia saw him immediately. Something flickered across her face, worry or relief. He couldn't tell. She approached his table with water and bread, but her movements were careful, guarded. "You came back," she said quietly. "I said I would." 2 weeks ago. There was no accusation in her tone, just statement of fact. "I'm sorry. Things got complicated." Julia set down the water glass. "The kind of complicated where you couldn't send a text, couldn't make a phone call?" "The kind where I was trying to keep the complications away from you." "By shutting me out completely?" Dante looked up at her, saw the hurt beneath her calm exterior, and felt something break inside him. "I was trying to protect you." "I didn't ask for protection. I asked for honesty." Julia's voice was low, mindful of other diners. "I asked you to let me decide what I could handle." "You can't handle this, Julia. Trust me. Don't do that. Don't make decisions for me about what I'm capable of." Her eyes flashed with something fierce. "I'm not a child. I'm not fragile. Stop treating me like I need to be sheltered from reality." She walked away before he could respond, attending to other tables with professional grace. But Dante saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she didn't look his direction. He'd hurt her. In trying to protect her, he'd hurt her worse than any truth could have. He ate his meal in silence, tasting nothing. When Julia brought his espresso, he caught her wrist gently. "Can we talk after you close?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be finished by 10. The wait was excruciating. Dante watched her move through the restaurant, watched her smile at customers while avoiding his gaze, and felt the distance between them like physical pain. This was what he'd been afraid of. The inevitable moment where his world poisoned something good. At 10, after the last customer left and the door was locked, Julia didn't lead him to the kitchen. Instead, she sat across from him at his table, arms crossed, waiting. "The Rossetti family challenged our territory," Dante began. "They said I was distracted weak. They were testing to see if they could move in on operations we control. And I had to prove they were wrong. I had to handle it in a way that made it clear my family is still strong, still in control. It required my full attention. I couldn't afford distractions." "Is that what I am? A distraction?" "Yes," Dante said honestly. "The best distraction I've ever had. The only thing in my life that makes me want to be someone different, someone better. And that's dangerous in my world." Julia's expression softened slightly. "What happened in those 2 weeks?" "Meetings, negotiations. Some violence, not from me directly, but at my order. We reached an understanding borders are clear again. peace is maintained." He looked at his hands. "But the cost was remembering exactly who I am and what I'm capable of ordering. And you thought I couldn't handle knowing that. I thought you deserved better than watching me turn into the monster I've been trying to convince you I'm not." Julia reached across the table and took his scarred hand. "Dante, I knew who you were from the beginning. Nonna Rosa told me. The other servers told me. I'm not naive. I know your family's reputation. I know the gray areas you operate in." She squeezed his hand. "What hurt wasn't learning about your world. What hurt was you disappearing without explanation, making me wonder if you were okay, if you'd changed your mind, if I'd meant anything at all." "You mean everything," Dante said, his voice rough. "That's the problem." "Why is that a problem?" "Because men in my position don't get to keep the things they love. They become targets, vulnerabilities. I've seen it happen. Families using loved ones as leverage, as collateral, as weapons. So your plan is what? To never love anyone, to spend your life alone to avoid giving your enemies ammunition." Julia's eyes were fierce. "That's not protection, Dante. That's prison. You've just built it yourself instead of letting others build it for you." She was right. Of course she was right. But knowing it and believing he deserved different were separate things. "I don't know how to do this," Dante admitted. "How to have you in my life without putting you at risk, without the darkness of my world touching you. Then we figure it out together. But you don't get to make that choice alone. You don't get to decide for me that I'm better off without you." Julia stood, pulling him up with her. "Come with me." She led him into the kitchen, but instead of preparing food, she turned to face him. "Do you remember what I told you the first night we cooked together? About kintsugi, Japanese pottery repair? Making the cracks part of the beauty." "Exactly. Your life has cracks, Dante. Big ones, dark ones. But that doesn't mean you're broken beyond repair. It means you need to find a way to incorporate them instead of hiding them." She placed her hands on his chest. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not even asking you to leave your family business, though I think you should consider it eventually. I'm asking you to be honest, to let me see all of you, not just the parts you think are acceptable." "What if all of me is too much? What if it's exactly right?" Julia countered. "What if I'm strong enough to hold space for your complexity? What if love isn't about finding someone perfect, but finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours?" Dante pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm terrified of losing you." "Then stop pushing me away. That's the only way you'll lose me, by choosing distance over truth." They stood like that for a long moment, breathing together, finding equilibrium. Then Julia stepped back and began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. "We're making risotto. It requires constant attention, constant stirring. You can't walk away or it burns. You have to commit fully or not at all." She handed him a wooden spoon. "Kind of like relationships." Dante found himself smiling despite everything, not subtle. "I'm from Napoli. Subtle isn't in my vocabulary." They cooked together, falling back into the rhythm they'd developed over months. Julia taught him to test the rice, to add broth slowly, to stir with patience and attention. And as they worked, Dante told her everything. About the Rossetti meeting, about the threats he'd made, about the violence he'd authorized, about the guilt that lived in his chest like a stone. Julia listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions, seeking to understand rather than condemn. And when he finished, she said something that changed everything. "You carry all this alone, all these decisions, all this weight, all this darkness. But Dante, you don't have to. You could talk to someone, not me, though I'll listen, but someone professional, someone who helps people process violence and trauma and moral complexity." "You mean therapy?" "I mean help support, A way to carry the weight that doesn't destroy you. She stirred the risotto, the motion meditative. You spend so much energy trying to protect everyone else. Maybe it's time someone helped you protect yourself. Even if that someone is a therapist who helps you process what you've had to do and decide who you want to be going forward. The idea was revolutionary. Men in his world didn't go to therapy, didn't admit to weakness or struggle or the psychological toll of their choices. But standing in this kitchen with Julia, Dante thought maybe that was exactly why they should. Maybe the old rules were what kept men like him trapped in cycles of violence and isolation. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I ask." The risotto was perfect creamy, rich, each grain of rice tender, but with a slight resistance at the center. They ate it standing at the prep counter, sharing a single bowl, and Dante felt the tension of the past 2 weeks finally ease. Julia hadn't run, hadn't condemned him, had seen him at his most honest and chosen to stay anyway. "I want to ask you something," Dante said, "and you can say no. Ask. Would you have dinner with me? Not here, somewhere else. A real date." Julia smiled. "This isn't real. This is us hiding in a kitchen after hours. I want to take you somewhere nice. Show you off. Be a normal man taking a beautiful woman to dinner." "You're not a normal man." "I know, but I want to try, just for one evening." She considered it, then nodded. "Okay, but not somewhere fancy. Somewhere real. Somewhere we can talk without performing for an audience." They made plans for Sunday, Julia's only full day off. Dante picked her up at her apartment, a tiny studio in a building that made him want to buy the entire block just to ensure she lived somewhere safer. But he kept that thought to himself, focusing instead on the fact that she'd invited him into her space. Let him see how she lived. The apartment was small but immaculate. Books in Italian and English stacked on every surface. A small shelf with photos of her family. A kitchen that somehow fit a full set of cooking equipment into minimal space. It smelled like her, like jasmine, and something sweet he couldn't identify. "It's not much," Julia said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's yours. That makes it perfect." He took her to a small trattoria in Sausalito, across the bay from the city. They sat outside overlooking the water, eating simple food and drinking wine as the sun set. For 3 hours, they talked about everything except his business. She told him about her sister's wedding plans, about her brother who wanted to be a doctor, about her mother's garden in Napoli. He told her about his grandmother's stories, about the San Francisco he remembered from childhood, before he knew what his family really did, about his secret love of architecture, and how he'd once dreamed of designing buildings. "You could still do that," Julia said. "Study architecture, design things. I'm too old, too committed to other paths. You're 35. You're not dead yet." She refilled his wine glass. "My mother always says it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." And who was I meant to be? I don't know. But I think it's someone who creates, instead of just maintaining. Someone who builds things that last, for reasons other than fear. On the drive back to the city, Julia fell asleep against his shoulder. Dante drove carefully, treasuring the weight of her trust, the simple intimacy of her sleeping form. When they arrived at her building, he walked her upstairs, and at her door, she invited him in for coffee. They both knew it wasn't about coffee. Inside her small apartment, with the door closed and the city lights glittering beyond her window, Julia turned to him. "I want you to stay. Not forever. Not tonight. But I want you to know you could. That I want you to." Dante cupped her face with his scarred hands. "I want that too. But I need you to be sure. Need you to understand what you're choosing. I'm choosing you. All of you. The scars, the complexity, the darkness, the light, I see it all, Dante. And I choose it anyway." He kissed her then, really kissed her for the first time, and it felt like coming home to a place he'd never been. Her hands traced his shoulders, his back, finding the tension there and soothing it. His hands tangled in her hair, pulled her closer, trying to communicate everything he didn't have words for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julia smiled. "Stay for coffee. Real coffee. And let's talk about what this means, what we're building." They sat on her small couch, coffee cooling in mugs they didn't drink from, and had the conversation that mattered about what they wanted, about the challenges his life presented, about her need for honesty and his need to know she was safe, about boundaries and expectations, and the simple fact that they both wanted to try, wanted to build something real, despite all the reasons it was complicated. "I can't promise you easy," Dante said. "I can't promise there won't be times when my world intrudes, when I have to make hard choices, when the darkness feels overwhelming. I'm not asking for easy, I'm asking for honest, for you to let me in instead of shutting me out when things get hard." Julia took his scarred hand. "And I'm asking you to believe that you deserve happiness, peace, love, all the things you've convinced yourself you're not allowed to have. I'm working on it, believing I deserve it. Then we'll work on it together." Dante left her apartment at midnight, but something fundamental had shifted. He drove home feeling lighter than he had in years, feeling like maybe, just maybe, he could have both, could manage his family responsibilities, while also having someone who saw him as human, who reminded him there was more to life than duty and survival. Over the following months, they built something careful and real. Thursday nights remained sacred, but they added other times too. Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, Tuesday evening walks along the waterfront, stolen lunch hours at small cafes where no one knew his name. Julia taught him to slow down, to notice beauty, to find joy in small moments. Dante showed her parts of the city she'd never seen, took her to the opera, to art galleries, to quiet places where they could just exist together. And slowly, Dante began to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, accumulating ways. He started therapy, seeing a psychologist who specialized in trauma and moral injury. He began making plans to legitimize portions of his family business, to shift operations toward legal enterprises. He set up a foundation in his grandmother's name to fund culinary scholarships for immigrant youth. He started to believe, tentatively, that he could be someone other than what his scars had convinced him he was. Julia was there for all of it. Not fixing him, not saving him, just being present. Celebrating small victories and holding space for difficult moments. Reminding him on hard days that growth wasn't linear, that setbacks didn't erase progress, that he was allowed to be human. 6 months after their first conversation, Dante made a decision. It was time to show Julia the full truth of his life, not just the parts he could sanitize for Thursday dinners. He invited her to a family meeting, the kind held in the back room of a restaurant his family owned, where decisions about territory and operations were made. It was a risk, a massive one, but Julia had earned the truth, and he needed her to see what she was really choosing before they went any further. She arrived dressed simply, her hair pulled back, her expression calm. Dante met her at the door, searching her face for fear or hesitation. He found only quiet determination. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I can still keep this part separate. I told you, I want to see all of you. That includes this." She took his hand. "I'm ready." The meeting was typical. Territory discussions, financial reports, decisions about which operations to maintain and which to phase out. Dante's cousins and associates spoke bluntly, using language that made violence sound like business, because for them, it was. And through it all, Julia sat quietly beside Dante, observing, understanding. When the meeting ended and the others filtered out, Dante's uncle, Pietro, approached. He was an old man now, white-haired and sharp-eyed, the last living connection to Dante's grandfather. "So this is the woman," Pietro said, studying Giulia. "The one who's got my nephew rethinking everything." "Zio, this is Giulia Conti," Dante said carefully. Pietro extended his hand, and Giulia shook it firmly. "Mr. Moretti." "You're from the south," Pietro observed. "Napoli." "Si, signore." "And you know what we are. What this family does." "I know enough," Pietro smiled, a complicated expression. "My nephew, he's been lost for a long time, since the fire. Since he decided he was too broken to deserve happiness. You've changed that. I see it in him. He's lighter. More himself than he's been in years." The old man paused. "But you should know, this life, it's not easy for the women who choose it. There are dangers, complications, sacrifices. With respect, sir, every life has those things. The question is whether the love is worth it." Giulia's voice was steady. "I believe it is." Pietro studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're stronger than you look. Good. He'll need that." He turned to Dante. "Your grandmother would like her. Don't mess this up, ragazzo." After his uncle left, Dante and Giulia walked through North Beach, processing the evening. "That was a test," Dante said. "Uncle Pietro was evaluating whether you're serious, whether you understand what you're getting into." "I know. And I am. Serious, I mean." Giulia stopped walking, turning to face him. "Dante, I'm not stupid. I know there are risks. I know your world is complicated and sometimes dangerous. But I've also seen how you're changing it, how you're trying to shift things toward legitimacy, how you're protecting people instead of just threatening them. That matters. It's slow. It'll take years to fully transition the business. Then we have years. I'm not going anywhere." Dante pulled her close, right there on the street, and held her like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. "I love you. I should have said it before, but I was afraid. Afraid it would make you a target. Afraid it would give the universe ammunition to take you away." "I love you too," Giulia whispered against his chest. "And I'm not that easy to take away." 3 months later, on a Thursday night at Nonna Rosa's after closing, Dante got down on one knee in the kitchen, where they'd spent so many evenings cooking together. He presented a ring, simple gold, with a small diamond, and asked Giulia to marry him, to officially join her life to his, despite all the complications that came with it. She said yes without hesitation. Said yes to the scars and the history and the uncertain future. Said yes to building something beautiful out of damaged pieces. Said yes to love that was real instead of perfect. The wedding was small, held in the garden behind Nonna Rosa's restaurant. Giulia's family flew in from Napoli, her mother weeping with joy, her siblings amazed by America. Dante's family attended too. The legitimate faces they showed the world and the complicated reality beneath. Uncle Pietro gave a toast in Italian about how love makes us brave enough to change. And when Dante and Giulia exchanged vows, promising to love each other completely, scars and all, it felt like the most honest thing Dante had ever done. He was choosing something beyond duty or fear. He was choosing hope, choosing the belief that he could be more than his worst moments, choosing a woman who saw him clearly and loved him anyway. Their life together wasn't perfect. There were still hard days when Dante's business required difficult decisions. Still moments when Giulia worried about his safety. Still challenges as they navigated combining their worlds. But through it all, they had Thursday nights, had the kitchen at Nonna Rosa's where they'd cook together, creating something delicious out of simple ingredients. Had the reminder that love, real love, wasn't about avoiding complexity, but about facing it together. Dante continued his work to legitimize the family business. It took 3 years, but eventually, most operations were legal, clean, defendable. He couldn't erase the past, couldn't undo the choices his family had made for generations. But he could change the future, could build something his children, when they eventually came, could be proud of. Julia opened her restaurant, a small place in North Beach, serving authentic Napoli cuisine. Dante helped finance it, but she ran it herself, hiring immigrant workers and paying them fairly, creating the kind of warm, honest space she'd found at Nonna Rosa's. The restaurant thrived, became known for food, made with love, for the owner who remembered everyone's name and story. And on Thursday nights, they'd close both restaurants and cook together, just the two of them, in the kitchen where everything had started, where a waitress had touched a mafia boss's scarred hand and seen not damage, but humanity, where a man convinced he was too broken to love had learned that the cracks in his life could be filled with gold, could become part of the beauty instead of evidence of ruin. Years passed, measured in Thursday dinners and quiet mornings, and the slow, steady work of building a life. Dante's hair began to silver at the temples. Julia laughed that he was becoming distinguished, that the gray made him look like a movie star. He told her she was more beautiful than the day they met, and he meant it. The years had added depth to her beauty, laugh lines around her eyes, a confidence that came from being loved exactly as she was. They had 2 children, a daughter first, Sophia, who had Dante's dark eyes and Julia's fierce spirit. Then a son, Marco, named for the man Dante had tried to save, a way of honoring the past while building toward different futures. The children grew up in both worlds, learning to make pasta from their mother while understanding the complicated legacy of their father's family. But they grew up knowing they were loved, knowing their father was trying to be better than what came before, knowing that change was possible even when it was difficult. On Sophia's 10th birthday, she asked Dante about the scars on his hands. They were sitting in the garden behind Julia's restaurant, the party winding down, and his daughter traced the ridges of damaged skin with gentle fingers. "How did you get these, Papa?" Dante looked at Julia, who nodded encouragingly. So he told his daughter the truth, about the fire, about trying to save someone, about how sometimes we fail even when we try our hardest, about how the scars reminded him that courage meant showing up even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. "So they're not bad scars?" Sophia asked. "They used to feel bad. I used to think they proved I wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough." Dante glanced at Julia. "But your mother taught me something important. She taught me that scars just prove we survived something hard. They don't define us. They're just part of our story." "I think they're beautiful," Sophia said simply. "They make you look like a warrior." Children had such clear sight, such honest perspective. Dante hugged his daughter close, grateful beyond words for this life he'd built, for the family who saw him completely and loved him anyway. That evening, after the children were asleep and the restaurant was clean, Dante and Julia sat in the kitchen, sharing a bottle of wine and some leftover birthday cake. It was Thursday, their sacred night. Though now it was just one of many sacred nights, many moments of connection woven through their days. "Do you ever regret it?" Dante asked. "Choosing this life. Choosing me with all the complications I brought." Julia looked at him like he'd asked whether she regretted breathing. Never. Not once. Even on the hard days, even when things were scary or uncertain, I never regretted choosing love over safety. I regret that I made it hard, that my past, my family, my choices complicated your life. Dante. She took his scarred hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after all these years. Everyone's past complicates their present. Everyone brings damage and history, and fears into relationships. The difference is whether we let that damage define us, or whether we choose to transform it into something else. We chose transformation. We chose to make something beautiful out of broken pieces. Kintsugi, Dante said, remembering her words from so many years ago. Exactly. And look at what we've built. A family, 2 businesses, a life full of love and food and laughter. Children who know they're cherished, a future that's different from the past. She kissed his knuckles. That's not something to regret. That's something to celebrate. Dante pulled her close, holding her the way he had that first night, when she'd told him she didn't pity him, when she'd challenged him to believe he was worth loving. I spent so many years thinking I was too damaged for happiness, convinced that men like me didn't get soft things, gentle things, love. And now? Now I know that everyone deserves love. Everyone deserves to be seen completely and chosen anyway. The scars don't disqualify us. They're just proof we've lived, we've struggled, we've survived. He looked around the kitchen at the evidence of the life they'd built. You gave me that, not by fixing me or saving me, but by refusing to let me hide. You gave me something too, Julia said. You showed me that strength comes in different forms, that powerful men can be gentle, that complicated pasts don't prevent beautiful futures, that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours. They sat there in comfortable silence, hands joined across the table. 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and built something real, something lasting, something that transformed scars into stories of survival and courage. Dante thought about the man he'd been years ago, sitting alone in corner booths, convinced he was destined for isolation, carrying shame like armor. That man seemed like a stranger now. Not because he'd changed completely. He still had the same scars, the same history, the same complicated family legacy, but because he'd learned to carry it differently. Learned that he didn't have to carry it alone. The restaurant that had been the site of their first meeting was being renovated, preparing for the next generation. Sophia had already announced she wanted to be a chef like her mother. Marco was still too young to know, but he loved being in the kitchen. Loved the smell of garlic and tomato sauce, loved watching his parents create something delicious from simple ingredients. What are you thinking about? Julia asked, seeing the distant expression on his face. About how grateful I am, for you, for this, for everything we've built. About how I almost missed it all because I was too afraid to believe I deserved it. But you didn't miss it. You were brave enough to stay when I touched your hand. Brave enough to let me see you. Brave enough to choose hope over fear. Julia smiled. That's the thing about courage, Dante. It's not about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to try anyway. Outside, the city lights glittered. The same city where Dante's family had operated for generations, where he'd built his complicated legacy, where he'd found the woman who changed everything. Inside, in the warm kitchen that smelled of family and food and love, 2 people sat together, proving that redemption was possible, that change was real, that love could transform even the most damaged hearts into something beautiful. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from believing no one can accept you completely, but there's also a kind of freedom that comes from finding someone who proves that belief wrong. Dante had lived with the loneliness for years, convinced his scars marked him as unlovable. But then Julia walked into his life and touched his damaged hands without fear, and everything changed. She didn't pity him. She didn't try to fix him. She just loved him, completely, exactly as he was. And in that love, Dante found something he'd stopped believing in. The possibility that he could be whole, not despite his scars, but because they were part of his story. Proof that he'd survived, that he'd tried, that he was brave enough to keep showing up even when it hurt. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Comment where you're listening from, and if you felt it was really worth it, consider becoming a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt this story was really worth listening to, click the super thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue creating stories that touch the soul. Because maybe that's what we all need to learn, that we're not too damaged to deserve love. We just haven't found someone whose love is big enough to embrace all of us. Yet. And when we do find that person, when we're brave enough to let them see our scars and vulnerable enough to believe their acceptance is real, everything changes. Not because the scars disappear, but because they stop defining us. They become part of our story instead of the entire story. They become proof of survival instead of evidence of failure. They become, like gold in broken pottery, the thing that makes us more valuable, more beautiful, more human. And that, perhaps, is the greatest transformation of all.